Thank you, Melody.
Yes.
And thanks everyone for, I said thank you. Thanks for attending. And today I'm going to talk about a poem from 1798, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. You probably heard of it. Maybe you've read it. If not, this talk will work for you. We're going to explore sort of the ideas of sin and redemption as the author Samuel Taylor Coleridge presents it, and also the image of the proverbial dead bird, the albatross, that hangs around the mariner's neck. I would like to begin by reference to Ernest Shackleton. Here is his ship, the Endurance. Ernest Shackleton was an Anglo-Irish explorer known for his incredible leadership in the harrowing expedition he led between 1914 and 1916. Shackleton had one explicit goal, and that was to cross Antarctica for the first time on foot. However, his ship, the Endurance, pictured here, became trapped in pack ice very early on. And for months, he and his crew of 27 people drifted with the ice floes until the immense pressure crushed their ship and forced them to abandon their ship. And despite the setback, Shackleton, in his strength as a leader and his resilience, really shone when he led his 27 crewmen on a series of daring adventures by lifeboat. He went across treacherous seas, and he was really determined to save all 27 crewmen. At one time he wrote in his journal, "I pray to God I can manage to get the whole party to civilization." He had abandoned his original mission by this point, clearly. Shackleton eventually determined that a small crew of 3 people, him and 2 other men, would undertake an 800-mile open boat journey in really horrendous conditions to an island in South Georgia where there was a whaling station. So they set out, and against all odds, Shackleton managed to rescue his entire crew, demonstrating exceptional leadership and really resilience, proving his title of the ship, Endurance, almost prophetically. The incredible feat of navigation and human endurance is considered among the greatest in exploration history, and maybe that's why you've heard the name Shackleton. What is important to note, though, and what often gets most overlooked, despite it being perhaps most important, is that his original mission failed. He did not achieve his original goal. And I'm going to talk about this more to come. But despite this, the story becomes a testament to human will, of his extraordinary leadership skills. Here's what Shackleton wrote in his memoir, South. This came quite a bit after his expedition. He wrote this memoir, and he said, "When I look back at those days, I have no doubt that Providence guided us, not only across those snowfields, but across the storm-white seas that separated Elephant Island from the landing place on South Georgia. I know that during that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to me often there were 4, not 3. That is, people. I said nothing to my companions on the point, but afterwards, Worsley said to me, 'Boss, I had a curious feeling on the march that there was another person with us.' Crean confessed the same idea. One feels the dearth of human words, the roughness of mortal speech, in trying to describe things intangible. But a record of our journey would be incomplete without a reference to a subject very near to our hearts." Shackleton explains his belief in God, Providence, guided the crew, and confesses that he and all the other crew individuals, 3 of them, believed there was a 4th presence with them the entire time. They all were on that same page. Isn't that sort of intriguing that they all came to that understanding? Apparently, T.S. Eliot, the great modernist poet in The Wasteland, thought this was fascinating enough to make reference to this third man idea that Shackleton expressed. This is what T.S. Eliot wrote. And this is from The Wasteland. He acknowledges in the footnotes that Shackleton inspired this idea. "Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you?" As a result of this sort of exploration by T.S. Eliot, it became a sort of well-known psychological term, the third man syndrome, or the third man factor. This idea that an unseen presence was able to provide comfort and support along one's journey. The third man factor has also become sort of a literary device, if you will. And I'm thinking of a couple examples just to bring this out. You might come up with others. There's a book by Max Brooks called World War Z. And in that book, there's an unseen presence called the Mets fan that guides the protagonist along her journey the whole time. Another one that comes to mind is from the movie Gravity, a great film I'd commend to you. In that movie, there's an astronaut whose companion dies, but later this companion comes back and provides supernatural assistance to fix the ship and to complete the mission. There's more than that. And you could even go back as far as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when King Nebuchadnezzar throws them in the fire and they see not a third, but a fourth man. Surely there's different connotations there in Daniel 3, but you see the idea of the third, the fourth presence that people express in traumatic situations. And it usually is those moments of facing death, or when one feels incredibly alone, it seems like where this third person appears, this fourth presence. There seems to be a psychological response in these experiences that creates an openness either to the Holy Spirit, an angel, or perhaps something evil or demonic. And there's examples I could pull from there. But it might be noteworthy that these encounters with the third man seem not to happen when one's strapped in front of a computer or when they're otherwise preoccupied with entertainment or distractions, when our awareness for such things becomes heightened. Be it as it may, I am beginning with this aside to Shackleton and the third man syndrome, because Shackleton, in his memoir, openly acknowledged that Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, he used to structure his memoir, right? He went on this journey. He's like, how am I going to write my memoir? He comes to this poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and says, I'll use this to organize my own journey. Many have also likewise used the Rime of the Ancient Mariner to structure their voyages, their journeys. This poem played a key part in creating really a new form of romantic literature and ultimately influenced the shape we expect a voyage to take. One of the most noteworthy features that I've sort of hinted at here is that Coleridge's poem transforms the failure of a trans-Antarctic crossing into a glorious triumph. And that's why we hold up Shackleton for the triumph of his endurance. And maybe you've had similar experiences where you set out to accomplish something. You had some mission, some purpose in front of you. And while that initial mission failed, now when you reflect on it, you see great worth in that journey, in that process. Maybe personal transformation comes out of it. No matter how you land on that question, what unites Shackleton, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and T.S. Eliot is that they are all part of sort of a voyage of discovery literature. The voyage of discovery literature is a wide net. I mean, you can go back to 8th century BC and consider the Odyssey as part of this voyage of discovery. You can consider Marco Polo's travels in the 13th century, Moby Dick, Treasure Island in the 19th century, or Life of Pi in 2002. All fit in this voyage of discovery literature. I might even include in the New Testament, Acts 27, when Paul is shipwrecked on the island of Malta. At one point, Paul writes, and consider this rising action, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued to rage, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. But then in a climactic moment, Paul urges, to keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. And sure enough, the prophetic insight that Paul shares with the crew comes to pass. And so we can find this voyage of discovery literature, this genre, embedded in other texts as well. And the Rime of the Ancient Mariner fits into the voyage of discovery genre pretty nicely, but it also helped to significantly reshape what one expects to discover while on the journey. Coleridge broke away from a tradition in the medieval era, for instance, where a knight might undertake a journey to rescue the fair maiden, and that's the point of the journey, the physical rescue and return. But this poem, as one of the most influential in romantic literature in the 18th and 19th century, turned expectations upside down, specifically forefronting the internal journey, the self-growth that happens through the journey and not the physical journey itself. So in the poem, the mariner, just like Shackleton, fails in his goal to reach that destination, but along the way discovers something very important about himself. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner tells the story of a sailor who commits a terrible act and endures a harrowing journey as a punishment. But this journey teaches him a valuable lesson about love, beauty, and ultimately life itself. So let me be more particular and outline the framework of this poem, how it unfolds and what happens. So the poem opens with an ancient mariner stopping a wedding guest who is about to go into the wedding. And this is really important because this is a framing narrative. Imagine yourself about to go to a wedding, you're sitting outside the door, everything's about to begin, and someone stops you, grabs your hand, shakes it, and starts telling you a story. And you can't help but listen. You're missing things inside, but you continue entranced by this individual who tells you this story. And the story is about a voyage that this mariner takes with his crew when they encounter an albatross. And an albatross is a bird with a 12-foot wingspan. It's the largest bird on Earth. It's like two of me laid across the stage, right? It's a long bird, huge wingspan. And despite being what it seems really a good omen to sailors as it hovers about the ship, the mariner says he decides to unexpectedly shoot the albatross and kill it with a crossbow. There's no reason we know of in the poem why he does it. It's intentionally left unclear. But this act of violence against a creature of God considered lucky brings incredible misfortune. The ship becomes trapped in ice, sound familiar? A little bit, and fog. The crew suffers thirst, and there's water everywhere, but not a drop to drink, is a famous line from the poem. There's water, and there's starvation that ensues. The mariner is tormented by guilt because he's killed this creature, and the albatross symbolizes his crime. It's hung around his neck, literally. He wears it, it says, like a cross as a constant reminder. The crew blames the mariner for their suffering, and eventually the crew dies one by one in a sort of slow falling. The mariner, though, remains alive the whole time, cursed to wander the earth for the rest of his life, in a sense. But then, it seems, redemption, at least in part, comes, because the ship is floating with the dead crew on board. This is like Pirates of the Caribbean, you can kind of see that too. But there's a dead crew, and there's the mariner. He's the only one alive, and he experiences despair and desolation. Suddenly, his vision is altered. Earlier, he had seen these slimy sea creatures, snakes or whatever, and he sees them as ugly, horrifying, just disgusting. But now, all of a sudden, he looks at them and he sees them as beautiful. He even loves them, and I'll share what he says. I mean, it's exuberant, the sense of wonder and joy he sees at these creatures of the sea. He blesses them, and the curse kind of falls a little bit. Well, the albatross falls off of his neck, literally, and it sinks like lead into the sea, right? And finally, the mariner continues, though, after this voyage. He gets back on land, and he wanders the earth, and he tells others. He's compelled, he's burdened. He has to share the news of what happened to him. By sharing his experience, he hopes to warn humanity against harming nature and emphasizes the importance of appreciating all living things. It's like an act of penance by him sharing. The poem ends with the wedding guest reflecting on the mariner's tale, highlighting the importance of prayer and love of all creation. And that's what the wedding guest seems to take from this tale that he has been beholden to as he's missed the wedding in large part because he's been listening to this crazed old mariner with intense eyes and a skinny hand and a long beard and looks a little crazy, but he stays and listens. And there's a lot of writing that's happened about this poem. There's a lot of different angles and perspectives. I don't think it's Christian poem, I would say. It uses Christian symbolism, and it uses sin and redemption, I think, driving at certain points that Coleridge is making. But I want to talk about that and how it relates to Coleridge's personal journey, which is itself fascinating. So here, we might start by talking about the mariner's sin. After killing the albatross, the mariner wears the bird around his neck, and his wings are just crippling. They're a huge encumbrance around his neck, so much that the mariner says he can't pray, he can't live. And it's a symbol of his own sin. It's a symbol of the murder that he's committed to this bird. Coleridge writes, in case you're not getting the direct parallel here, right? Instead of the cross, the albatross about my neck was hung. So it was William Wordsworth who first suggested to Samuel Taylor Coleridge this idea of a mariner killing an albatross. Actually, Wordsworth had read in an explorer, Captain George Shelvocke's Voyage Around the World. He read this book, and Shelvocke recounts the story of himself on a voyage, and there is an albatross floating, hovering above their ship. And all of a sudden, when the bird appears, the weather turns bad, and it stays bad as soon as the bird arrives. So they devise to kill the bird, and they do that in Shelvocke's story. The same thing happens in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, only that the motive for the mariner killing the albatross is left blank. This creates greater mystery and really this penchant for sin, murder, and the omen that follows is in place. So that's where he got the idea. But since writing the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, there has been lots of other artists that have picked up this idea. There's a well-known French poet, Charles Baudelaire, who wrote The Albatross, a poem. And in that poem, he writes about the albatross's wings symbolically carrying the weight of the poet's imagination and empathy. This is what Charles Baudelaire writes. The poet resembles this prince of the clouds, the albatross, and sky, who frequents the tempest and laughs at the bowman. When exiled on earth, the butt of hoots and jeers, his giant wings prevent him from walking. This idea basically is that the weight of this albatross's wings carry in the air where the poet resides, but when walking on the earth with other humans, it's unbearable. So the poet rises like the albatross's wings. Herman Melville in Moby Dick also picks up this idea of the albatross from Coleridge. Well, he claims that it's not Coleridge, but he says, God's great unflattering laureate, or nature, is responsible for this great symbol. That's a quote from Melville. Melville calls this bird, the albatross, a white phantom that sails in all imagination, embodying great worth for the poet, for our imagination. It's a symbol incarnate of that. Still later, taking this even further, C.S. Lewis in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader takes this image a step further. The children in Narnia are sailing closer to an island where dreams come true, especially our worst nightmares. They're sailing closer and closer. They try to row back, but are making no progress. The horrors continue to creep into their minds, and they start to panic, and that's when Lucy prays, Aslan, Aslan, if you ever loved us at all, send us help now. And at that, a beam of light shines on the ship. Lucy looks at the beam and says, at first it looked like a cross, but it turns out to be an albatross. The albatross circles the ship 3 more times and then leads the ship out of darkness into the light. And Lewis writes, but none except Lucy knew that as it circled the mast, it had whispered to her, courage, dear heart. And the voice, she felt sure, was Aslan's. So in Narnia, usually Aslan appears as a lion or a lamb, but here takes the image of an albatross. The embodiment of this bird is Christ. So when the mariner, going back to the poem, when he kills the albatross, the weight of his sin is immense. He is Judas-like. In the poem, the sin of killing the albatross is identified as alienation, particularly against the natural order of things. In this state, even what might be normally viewed as a blessing, the mariner encounters it with a sense of dread. It's awful, it's darkened. Put simply, it's a failure to respect to kill the albatross, who is seen as a fellow creature of God. Theologically speaking, it is a refusal to acknowledge the real presence of God in all things. At this point, I hope to have shown how the albatross being killed relates to the mariner's sin. I think that's pretty clear. But it also runs parallel to Coleridge's life and his own sin. Malcolm Guite has a book called Mariner, and I'm indebted to him for this sort of parallel between Coleridge and the mariner. Because in his later writings, Coleridge referred to himself as the mariner, way later after the poem had been written. He wrote the poem at 25 years old, which is kind of cool to note. But he writes his poem, and he feels a deep connection later in his life to the character he created. And so later in life, Coleridge had arthritis. He goes to the doctor. What does the doctor give him at that time? Opium. He becomes deeply addicted to opium, and he tries to get off again and again and again. It rocks his relationships. His marriage falls apart. He's alienated from his family. He worked furiously on projects for a while, but then it would fall apart. That kind of trend happened again and again. And instead of being driven by his ambitions or his achievements at a young age, he is led by the disappointment, by the guilt that he feels at his life's failures. Then after sort of a decade or so of dissent, he became a man of profound faith and a Christian. He was released from addiction and fruitfully lived for 17 more years, as evidenced by the relations of his wife and his children being restored. Like the ancient mariner, Coleridge knew that he lived by God's forgiving grace and not by his own achievements, however good some of those achievements really were. Something of the experience of the mariner's journey is wound together with Coleridge's deep Christian conviction. And I think I can make this pretty clear by the poem that Coleridge wrote called Epitaph. I mean, this is like something you would see on his tombstone. And remember in your mind the mariner and the wedding guest. Keep that image. Because here is Coleridge in his epitaph. He says, "Stop, Christian passerby, stop, child of God, and read with gentle breast. Beneath this sod a poet lies, or that which once seemed he. Oh, lift one thought and prayer for STC, that he who many a year with toil of breath found death in life, may here find life in death, mercy for praise, to be forgiven for fame he asked and hoped through Christ, do the same." So this came much later in life, long after this poem, long after sort of his downs and ups. The way Coleridge calls out to the passerby reflects the mariner and the wedding guest pretty nicely. So just as Coleridge and his sin runs parallel to the mariner and his sin, so does Coleridge's redemption, in a sense, run parallel to the mariner's redemption. At his lowest, the mariner cries out in agony to die. He wants to die, but he can't. He's hopeless. He's stuck in a living hell. However, once the burden of the albatross is released and falls like lead into the sea, his sin is cast as far as the east is from the west. And so we might ask, what is redemption? Well, that's a big question, but in the poem, it's a restoration. A balance of love and beauty is restored, and that's the offense of the mariner. That's his crime. That's his sin. He has offset that balance, and it's restored. And the mariner's redemption is really by and for love, particularly the love of every living creature. That's really how it's expressed in the poem. And he looks at the water snakes, which he had earlier been horrified with their sliminess, and says, "Some kind of saint took pity on me." That's how he words it. He sees these shiny creatures. I skipped a bunch of slides, I think. Oh, there they are. He sees these slimy creatures, and he takes it, like I said, one step further. You have to sort of read this to understand what he ascribes to these slimy sea creatures. He says, "Oh, happy living things." You have to really see ugly water snakes here. "Happy living things, no tongue their beauty might declare. A spring of love gushed from my heart, and I blessed them unaware. The self-same moment I could pray. And from my neck so free the albatross fell off and sank like lead into the sea. So it's related to his ability to pray, to live. And we see that the mariner's repentance is a turning away from hate and ugliness, and it's a ability to see love and beauty, as he says, love and beauty, and especially the beauty, right, of these creatures that were once ugly come into focus. And it's not that the snakes themselves are beautiful, it's that he sees beauty through them. And this is where I'm going to again come back to C.S. Lewis, who I could pull from others who have said a very similar kind of statement as far back as St. Augustine or Augustine. He writes this in The Weight of Glory. Lewis says, the books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust in them. It's not in them in a beautiful book, in a beautiful song. It only came through them, and what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our past, are good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. For they are not the thing itself, they are only the scent of the flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. In this context, again, we say the mariner is mistaken if he believes that the beauty is in the water snakes. Beauty is not in the snakes. It's a deeper longing that he understands through that vision. The deeper desire is not in the creature, but in the creator, put simply. A fascinating parallel occurs in Numbers 21. You might know this from the Old Testament, where Moses is in the desert with the Israelites. They're suffering from their unbelief, and they begin getting attacked by poisonous snakes. They desire the promised land. They want to get there, even though it is their sin that has caused them to wander in the desert. And they nonetheless blame Moses. As judgment, God sends these poisonous serpents into the camp, and the people begin to die. And when they came to Moses, Moses begins to pray. And God instructs him to make a bronze serpent, put it on a pole, so that people can look at it and be healed. It's not the bronze image that heals them, right? It's that act of faith that they're taking by trusting in what they're told, doing what God told them to do. And it's a lesson of faith, and it's picked up in John's gospel. But for the mariner, his redemption also comes through the creatures that he once saw as horrendous, ugly, evil. Now they are seen in a different light, as an image of love, beauty for all creation. Unlike the bronze serpent incident, the poem leaves the exact nature of the mariner's redemption a little more open-ended than we might see in Numbers 21. This makes sense considering Coleridge's biography. He, at 25, wrote this poem. He had not really found redemption as he later expressed it. The second part, though, of the mariner's redemption and the sort of mysterious transformation is the burden he feels to tell everybody he knows about his voyage. Here's how he says it. This is a mariner as he comes up to the wedding guest. Agony returns until my ghastly tale is told. The heart within me burns. I pass like night from land to land. I have strange power of speech. That moment that his face I see, I know the man that must hear me. To him, my tale I teach. So it seems, we might say, that the only thing that provides relief for the mariner is the ability to tell the burden of his story to everybody he can find who will be a listener. And he pulls people in, he pulls the mariner in with his own hand. When was the last time you felt an overwhelming urge, a burden to tell something to someone, anyone that would listen, of something important in your life that has happened? What comes to mind to me is an individual I knew last year in a church group that I was leading on mental health in a church, and we were just sharing our stories, and this guy said that he had physical symptoms. He had trouble sleeping, he had incredible stomach pain, these headaches that kept happening. He thought something was really wrong with him, and he started to go to the doctor, who did all these scans, did more, months of searching. I think he said half a year even. It was a long process of testing and diagnosis. And at the end of that journey, they said, I don't think you have anything, no virus, no cancer, nothing like that. I think you're incredibly stressed. You have incredible anxiety, and that's causing physical symptoms. And he had trouble understanding that that was possible. He's like, I've never been told that that was possible at all. And he described what he was on as an evangelistic mission to tell people about the dangers of stress and how it was killing him, and hoping other people take advantage of the resources that are out there for them, therapeutic, medicine, and otherwise. And so he didn't know that, and he wanted to tell other people all the time about what he had learned. That's what kind of comes to mind in my own life. And the Mariner, though, is on a similar mission, right, to tell everyone, anywhere he meets. The poem's entire content is framed as an interaction between the wedding guest, who is abruptly stopped, and the strange old mariner, who forces his story on him. This is how it's said. You have to, again, imagine this initial moment. The wedding guest says, now wherefore stoppest thou me? The bridegroom's doors are open wide, and I am next of kin. The guests are met, the feast is set. And the mariner holds him with his skinny hand. There was a ship, quoteth he. Hold off, unhand me, gray beard loon. Right? So you can see he's really pulling away, and he's really pulling him towards him. But the fascinating part is the wedding guest stays and listens to this whole epic poem, as it were. You have to imagine something like this. You're going to the grocery store, you're on, a mission to get something and get out and get home, but there's someone outside the store that comes up and shakes your hand and starts talking, and you do everything you can to just get away, but you don't. There's something they're saying that's interesting, that's fascinating. You stay and listen. You sit with them on the rock, and he tells you a 30-minute story, and you don't regret it. And in fact, your life, your understanding, your appreciation for beauty, for love is radically transformed. That's the image this poem hopes to impart to us. And we certainly, like the mariner, all have certain things that lay heavy on our heart. We may not be so forceful as he is, but we all have a burden that's lifted when we tell some other person about something that's really meaningful to us. So I would encourage you to consider what that is. For Coleridge, I would say that it's his identification as a romantic that best identifies his burden that I think he's communicating through the poem. The Romantics were a group of artists who saw the modern, material, and instrumental view of nature as utterly deadening, as they worded it. That would ultimately crush any notion of a soul or a person. Theirs was an age that reduced people to things, material things, neurons, we might say today. And they belittled the imagination as groundless opinion, subjective nonsense. And we still have those pressures, I think, with us today. Coleridge's romantic vision is worth acknowledging because it's an antidote to living in a world of deadly rationalizations, in a world where an ethic of optimization, as Matt talked about yesterday, this sort of optimizing effectiveness, this sort of ethic of expediency is the key to it all. The sort of romantic is fighting against that trend. What would have been expedient, what would have been proper, what would have been convenient for the wedding guest was just to go inside the wedding and never see this mariner again. But he doesn't, and he's not sorry. Because the poem teaches him a lesson, and it teaches us a lesson too. And that is what grips your imagination might be life-changing, even if it doesn't have a direct impact or result, or it isn't what we expected the mission to be. If it changes our outlook, that might be more important than anything. The poem is against this ethic of expediency and invites us to go on a poetic pilgrimage with Coleridge. I mean, that's what he's really inviting us to do. What is the value of poetry? What is the value of listening to something? What's the value of a Sabbath rest? How is that going to help you do your job? While the poem only provides clues to the nature of redemption that I've sort of hinted at, what seems clear is that the road to salvation, or rather the process of ongoing sanctification, we might say, is a journey. It's a pilgrimage. It keeps going. And, while you may have never heard of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, T.S. Eliot, William Wordsworth, I don't know if you read these individuals. The Bible itself is filled with pilgrimages. I think of Abraham's journey to the promised land, a pilgrimage that begins with the Lord saying to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to a land I will show you in the future, right? The Israelites' exodus from Egypt can also be seen as a pilgrimage, a journey towards freedom and a new covenant with God. I think as Christians, we're also on our own pilgrimage. We're following in the footsteps of the way, as Jesus is referred to. Christians walk in the path he laid out, and our life's challenges and experiences are seen as part of this pilgrimage, part of this journey, shaping and refining us along the way. So the journey symbolizes the effort required to grow in faith and understanding, and the pilgrim represents the ongoing quest for closer relationship with God. I like how this is phrased by Robert Mulholland Jr. in Invitation to a Journey, a roadmap for spiritual formation. Consider how he describes the spiritual journey. Our spiritual journey is not our setting out by getting information and applying it correctly to find God as an object out there to be grasped and controlled by us. It is a journey of learning to yield ourselves to God and discovering where God will take us. I would say if you are here, you are likely on a pilgrimage. I've attended my fair share of music festivals, and I can say that the journey of getting there, the bands I saw, the conversations that sometimes were unexpected, random, those contributed greatly to my journey, my sense of self, and my spiritual growth. It might be a stretch, but the poem's ending nicely captures the moment of moving beyond an experience, moving beyond an important milestone on any journey, and I think it's worth sharing. So this is the end of the poem. Farewell, farewell, but this I tell to thee, thou wedding guest. He prayeth well who loveth well, for man and bird and beast. He prayeth best who loveth best, all things both great and small. For the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all. The mariner whose eye is bright, whose beard with age is hoar, is gone. And now the wedding guest turned from the bridegroom's door. He went like one that hath been stunned, and is of a sense forlorn. A sadder and wiser man, he rose the morrow morn. What is described here is a wisdom gained with a bit of sadness, a tinge of sadness. But the next morning arrives with a renewed ability, a restoration of prayer. The redemption possibility allowed the mariner to care for all living things, great and small, man and beast and bird. So what follows the mariner's sin? Well, it's not the punishment to the third and fourth generation, but a showing of love to 1,000 generations. What follows is the mariner's sense of God's grace, the one thing that enables any of us to find redemption through the pilgrimage we are all journeying on through the deep seas of today's world. Thank you for listening.